Hello and welcome to Higher Ed Live, the live weekly web show about the world of higher education, where we're all about digital development, professional empowerment. I am your host, Seth Odell, and thank you guys as always for tuning in and joining the show. As you can see, I am not at Southern New Hampshire University as I am most days. Just got back from a shoot downstate, but happy to be here, happy to make it. Off the bat, gotta apologize, guys, and say that I don't have a weekly five or an unsolicited shout out for you. It has been an unbelievably crazy week for me, so I hope that's okay. If there are big news stories going out in your world, please share the links with the hashtag so I can share them. I'm just underwater this week, but I made it. We're here for the show, we're here for the topic, and before we unveil what that is, and guys, it's going to be a doozy today, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors. HigherEdLive is sponsored by Integral, the creators of the Schools app on Facebook. Check out that webinar series about how private social networks can increase yield and retention. That happens next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We're sending a tweet out with a link to that in just a second. We're also sponsored by Omni Update, the leading web content management system CMS provider for higher education. The company's web CMS OU campus, it's secure, it's scalable, with great tools, features, deployment flexibility, and an awesome user community to boot. Join Omni Update's webcast on mobile browsing behaviors and expectations of college-bound high school students. That's right, I'll say that again. Omni Update, some really fresh data you haven't seen before on mobile browsing behaviors and expectations of college-bound high school students. I'm getting a link for you. I'm working on it. I'm going to get it out to you guys. You want to participate in this webcast. It's going to be cool. And finally, we are sponsored by Scavenger. That's right, Scavenger, a Google-funded mobile game about going places, doing challenges, and on top of that, even earning points. Did you know that Scavenger partnered with IBM for a cross-country higher ed campaign? They did. Check it out. We're sending the link. You better read it. Click on it. Thank them. Thank all of our sponsors for making this happen. Guys, once again, thank you all for being here for Higher Ed Live. Today's show is the politics of education. Well, what does that mean, really, right? That is a pretty loaded topic. We've been talking a lot at Higher Ed Live for about a year and a half now, a lot of different subject matters. What we haven't talked about is one of the biggest external influences on education, and that's the political arena that our country is in, right? So how are things being affected? That's federal regulations, that's state funding, all the way down to local, back and forth. People talking about student loan bubbles. We're going to cover all of this today. My goal today is to really kind of hammer out the politics of education, have a conversation with you guys, and on top of that, though, get some questions answered. Because as you guys have known in the past, when I do a show I haven't done before, a lot of times we do the state of the state of mobile, and we'll do a big, broad overview. I've done these things before. Well, that's what we're doing with politics and education today. And with today's guest, we're going to break it all down. Not only do I have a lot of questions for him, but he said to me before the show, he said, let's see if we can get some rapid-fire Twitter questions coming in. He wants to see if he can keep up and make it happen. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on today's guest and allow him to introduce himself, and we're going to talk a little bit. So again, without further ado, let me welcome former congressional staffer Dan Kidera to the show. Dan, how you doing?
Not bad. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for joining the show. I appreciate it. And for a little bit, why don't you mind giving some of the viewers a little bit of your background so they know where you're coming from with some of your thoughts and opinions on today's show?
Sure. I am a former congressional staffer in the office of New York Senator Chuck Schumer, New York senior senator. Worked in both the minority and the majority in the Senate during the Bush years. Now I am a lawyer, so you can say I went from one dark art to the next.
Fair enough. Well, Dan is someone I turn to all the time to talk politics and always look to get his insights. So when it came to trying to do a recap kind of overview show, there was nobody better to bring on the show to break this down than Dan. So guys, I'm going to start with my questions, but as we said, bring them in on Twitter. I'm going to try to display those tweets. I'm going to ask him whatever I can. So Dan, I thought the best way to break down the conversation today might be to start just by sort of segment. This is such a huge subject matter. There's probably so many of these items we'll talk about today that we could do a whole show on. So let's talk a little bit about the federal level historically. I mean, there's a lot of issues with federal regulation in education, Title IX, other things people are familiar with. But that's a pretty big place to start. I mean, the regulating the for-profits. How has the support for education, do you think, changed on the federal level over the past, let's start with a few decades?
I think the biggest thing when you look at education over the past few decades is you've seen a change in terms of education now becoming big business. Education used to be more of an investment tool that government sought. You can date back to things like the GI Bill, where government really viewed education as a way to make people's lives better and to promote a future. It's tended to be in recent years that education has become much more big business, especially when you get to the K-12 levels with things like charter schools, with online education, with some of these new things that have happened, it's become more about making money where dollars can go and shifting dollars really than on the investment in education and how we can get people graduating high school into college, graduating college, and becoming productive members. You've also seen a big shift in recent years in sort of how education has become politicized. I think a lot of that has to do with unions and the roles unions play at the K-12 level. The teachers union is a big ally of the Democratic Party traditionally, and recently you've seen in places like Wisconsin, you saw with Governor Scott Walker and his administration really going after unions, going after the teachers union. And you've seen a lot of that almost as being a way that Republicans view it as almost trying to weaken the Democratic Party, I think, by going after unions and by weakening the teachers unions. And so you've seen that shift both from a investment in education to a big business, and also in the way education now gets politicized.
Now, when we talk about a big business, I definitely agree. I've seen there's been a big shift, especially as someone who works in the online arena. I follow a lot of the online for-profits. There's a lot of stuff going on in that realm. One first big loaded question. I used to work at UCLA, and we did have a government community relations division. Obviously, we're a huge university, 35,000 staff. But what are your thoughts on lobbying in higher education? I know we'll probably get into this even more on the state level. But when you talk about education getting politicized, getting big business, is there a conversation between senators and leaders of local colleges beyond just let's make sure people are getting educated? Is this something that's kind of having closed door conversations? Are lobbyists being involved, and has that kind of grown or changed at all, do you think?
Well, lobbying as the form that we know it today is still a relatively new phenomenon. It's probably only about 20 to 30 years old, lobbying in the traditional sense that we see it now, and you do see it a lot in education. At the congressional level, on the federal level, the budget comes out usually sometime right around now, sometime in February. By the time it gets voted on, you're going to have college presidents with their government relations teams and their lobbyists invading Capitol Hill. Before budgets are voted on, every college president, especially at bigger universities, a place like UCLA, is going to make sure that their college president has FaceTime with individual congressional leaders and individual senators, members, to talk about this is the money we need, this is the funding we need, these are the appropriations we need, these are our priorities for the year. And they frame it in how it's important to the district. So at a place like UCLA, you cut our federal funding, that can mean jobs. That can mean research dollars, which lead to jobs. And politicians, all things become local. You don't want to risk losing jobs. You don't want to cut money if it means you're going to lose jobs, because that's going to hurt your reelection.
I'm sending a question out now online. I'm just curious if other folks, if their campuses have lobbyists. It's definitely something that I experienced at UCLA, but I'm curious where, with such large, small universities, where the kind of jump is between investing in that. Before we get into talking about Obama, his State of the Union last week, and his 2020 goals, there's a lot of stuff there when we talk about federal. Let's talk about the guy who came before him. So let's talk about Bush just for a second. The No Child Left Behind Act was obviously a huge, major educational initiative. Interestingly enough, it was obviously led by a conservative, but it was very heavily involved with the federal government getting involved in education. This is something that a lot of teachers now talk poorly about. There's still conflict. I'm just curious, on the governmental level, where are we at with No Child Left Behind? Do you see changes happening with that? Because that's something that definitely ripples up even in the higher education world.
Well, No Child Left Behind was actually, while it was a Bush administration, it was one of their keystone pieces of legislation. It was actually given huge bipartisan support, in part because the Bush administration worked strongly with Senator Kennedy at the time. So Senator Kennedy gave it a big sort of liberal push and was able to get it passed. In terms of where it stands now, it's actually been in the news recently. The Obama administration Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, is in the process of allowing states to waive out of No Child Left Behind. So there's an application process going on now. The Department of Education is reviewing applications for states to say, we're going to achieve the goals of No Child Left Behind without working within some of the rigid framework of No Child Left Behind, and ask for waivers out of the program. And right now, the Department of Education is reviewing some of those applications. I know within the past week, the Secretary's office has put out statements that are supportive of some of these state efforts, but still point to some troubling signs between holding schools accountable for poor achievement gaps, which is one of the biggest things about No Child Left Behind, is it tried to close that achievement gap between some of the rich schools and some of the poorer schools, and make sure that things like race, things like socioeconomic background didn't play into educational success.
Now, I want to shift a little bit more forward and talk about Obama in general. There's a lot of things going on. I've talked a lot on the show previously about his 2020 goal of making us the most educated nation again in the country. But beyond that, let's talk a little bit about his State of the Union, because you talked about education in the State of the Union recently. I'm sure you obviously saw it. What were your thoughts on that? And then maybe we'll dive into a few other items on his political agenda.
Well, just in terms of the broad outline of the speech, I thought the speech itself was pretty fantastic. His goals for focusing on education were ambitious, but that's where we need to be. I mean, it was President Kennedy who said in 1960 that we were going to put a man on the moon within the next 10 years, and by the end of it, we did. We need politicians who are ambitious leaders and put together plans. Now, the 2020 goals that President Obama set out might not sound achievable, but if you look at it, they're goals that need to be set. The United States, it wasn't too long ago that we ranked first in the world in terms of percentage of our population who graduated college. Now we rank 14th. So we need that refocusing. We need that re-energization on getting kids to go to college, graduate college, or put them into programs, trade programs, community college, things where they can be successful. I mean, college might not necessarily be for everybody, but there are programs in place, and that's some of the initiatives that President Obama is putting forward. Some of his big push on community colleges, on technical training programs to allow people to be successful moving forward beyond high school.
Now, first of all, I'm a huge supporter of Obama's 2020 initiative. Obviously, I definitely think it's a travesty the way we've slipped in education. Here's where I have a question for you. We're going to shift a little bit from federal to state. Totally, we want to be back to being the number one with the most college graduates. Obviously, we're 11th or 12th, depending how you count right now. But as you said, this is going to fall on community colleges. This is going to fall on getting more people educated. There's a big disconnect, it seems, is especially in twofold. One, you have essentially schools trying to be more selective. In California, you actually have community colleges trying to be more selective and recruit less. But then the bigger issue, and we'll tackle this one first, is state funding for public institutions like a UCLA, like a SUNY, these systems that are getting their budgets cut. So let's talk about that. Where are we at with state funding? Because one of the big disconnects for someone like me is how can we increase the number of students who are graduating and at the same time that we're funding our state institutions, at least our land-grant institutions, less and less every single budget year?
Well, part of that has to do with the sheer size that is public education, especially at the higher ed level for most of these states. Take a state like California. You're not talking just about UCLA. You're talking about a whole California system that has schools up and down the state, and it's a massive undertaking. So when you talk about budget cuts, you're immediately going to focus on higher education just because of the sheer size of it. There's no real way around budget cuts. And so one of the big things states can do, and it's one of the big things the Obama administration is pushing, is actually figure out ways to increase state coffers. One of the reasons states are having to cut budgets right now is because states don't have the revenue coming in that they used to. And so it goes more than just cutting education, and more goes into economic policies and job creation that's really going to focus on increasing the tax revenue again, so you don't necessarily have to cut these programs.
So one thing, too, that I just want to hammer on a little bit, having lived in California for so long, understood this, but this is something that, at least with California's setup, was interesting, is that in California, because of voter referendums, I think the term is, you're limiting also where state representatives can cut in the budget, right? I mean, there's something about, the fact is that, I mean, I hate to say this, but is education like the budget cutting sweet spot?
It is, in part because what I said, the sheer size of it, also because a lot of that revenue legislators feel like can be made up. So if you're talking at the K-12 range. Anytime that a state cuts funding for K-12 public education, legislators feel like, well, if education's a priority to those towns, those counties, they can make it up at a local level. They can increase property taxes to make up the budget gap. If you're talking about higher education, we can cut funding. They can make up for it with tuition increases. And that's some of the areas where you see tuition being raised, especially at state schools. What you see a lot of the times are state budget cuts that, and you saw it in California, where states try to make up for it with massive increases on out-of-state tuition. And you saw that with some of the riots that went on at some of the higher education places in California, especially on the graduate and law school levels, where students revolted because they were looking at 35, 40, 50% tuition increases in 1 year, and it's because of budgets. In California, the budget situation is a mess, in part because through voter referendums in California, they have a situation where you need 2/3 of the legislature to agree to any tax increase. So California is a mess because they can't possibly raise revenue. It all has to come on the cut side when you talk about dealing with budgets. And so that's part of the mess in California. It just has to do with this crazy notion of needing 2/3 support in the legislature in order to get any tax increase passed.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's a huge thing. And the thing you hit on in there that resonates with me is talking about the fact that they can keep raising tuition. And we talk about skyrocketing tuition prices in higher education and budget cuts, but the reality is, as long as we do keep raising tuition and students keep paying it, it's going to be a bit of a perpetual system, I can imagine, that, yeah, they can cut the budget because, yes, students will pick up the tab. And that kind of, at least potentially, and that leads me to my next biggest question, which is talking about the student loan industry. Because what we're talking about then is if the state budgets aren't the same and they're reducing, then the students are picking up the tab. But the students pick up the tab on credit, and they're not paying it right away. And they're potentially paying it decades down the line. They could be defaulting on it. Some people say we're in a bubble. Where is, whether it's Obama, federal government, where is the political conversation right now on the student loan issue? Because I have to imagine that's something that's got a lot of action going on.
You hear a lot on student loan issues, whether it's the new grassroots movement that's going on online that's got about 700,000 signatures on a petition that urges the Obama administration that says if you want to turn the economy around and you want to create jobs, you have to increase demand. The best way to increase demand is to forgive student loan debt. So there's this movement going on that says rather than bail out banks, rather than bail out Wall Street, bail out the people. Bail out people who have taken out student loans. Student loan debt now in this country surpasses credit card debt. There's over $1 trillion in student loan debt out in this country. And so there's a movement afoot that says, a grassroots movement that says, rather than bail out banks, why don't we put the money back in the pocket of people and forgive student loan debt, allow them to spend? Now, it's an unrealistic proposal going on, but there is grassroots movement going on. So the Obama administration at least is listening. When they passed the health care bill, the Affordable Care Act, wrapped into the Affordable Care Act was an overhaul of the student loan industry. So for people who have student loans, myself, I have my own student loans. When I took out student loans to go to law school, the way I did it was I borrowed money from a private lender. In my case, I borrowed money from Citigroup. They were federally backed loans. So that meant no matter what, if I defaulted on my loans to Citigroup, the federal government was guaranteeing those loans to Citigroup. Citigroup was going to get their money no matter what. So you have this system in place where Citigroup was able to lend money to me as a student with absolutely no risk involved. And they were able to make the interest profit. Interest ranges anywhere from 6.8% now, I believe, on some of these federal Stafford loans to as high as 8.5% on some PLUS loans that are out there and some other loans that are out there. So the banks were able to make these 6.5% to 8.5% interest profits off of guaranteed loans. What the Obama administration did was they cut out the middleman, essentially. They said rather than that profit on these loans going to banks, we're going to save that money as the federal government, and we're going to in turn invest that money into things like Pell Grants and invest that money back into higher education and make it more affordable for kids to go to college. So right now, I think, or in 2013, 2014, when the bill goes in place, students are going to lend or borrow their money directly from the Department of Education. Since the department already guarantees the money, this way you just cut out the middleman and are able to save a ton of money, which you can reinvest into affordability programs like Pell Grants. Yeah. You've also saw it in the State of the Union. The Obama administration said, and coming out of the State of the Union, we're going to hold colleges accountable. If you are increasing tuition at rates that is unforeseeable for students to afford, we're going to hold you accountable. We're going to make it harder for you to get student loans. We want to make it easier for kids to go to college and be able to afford college.
And the federal government has also done some interesting things with the Pell Grants, making, lately at least, making new requirements on student performance, which has been really interesting, saying that if students are getting Pell Grants, they have to essentially be hitting within a certain range for grades, hitting for a certain range to guarantee that they're completing the courses, or they can pull the rest of those loans as well. So it's the idea that, because a lot of times schools will sort of spend the money they don't necessarily have exactly. The student hasn't completed. So it's interesting, they're putting in these almost this withdrawal policy for funds. So that's been an interesting element to follow, but that's a huge, huge arena that I think is important for people to understand. The student loan issue is a terrifying one to me, and it is nice to see, in this case, I believe at least, the government stepping in and trying to find a way to protect the student and to protect the system a little bit and make sure that they're able to get the money to go to college and schools are able to get the money to get the students in the door, but that at the same time the people aren't being necessarily abused. It's a little interesting to see a no-risk loan like that with that kind of interest rates. So no, that's something we're talking about with the current administration. Let's talk about the next administration, which, as we all know, could either be shortly upon us or could be another 4 years away with the upcoming re-election. Now, as some people know, we had Mitt Romney on campus at SNHU. We're being in New Hampshire. This stuff's all over the place. I have one question before we get into the specific politicians, because I am going to ask about them. I want to ask one big and general question, which is, with this current election, the primary election with the Republicans, the economy is by far the biggest issue right now, obviously, especially with the war in Iraq having been completed. This is the topic we're talking about. But to me, at least, I haven't felt like education is being discussed enough. And that to me is weird, because I don't see a huge disconnect between the economy and education, not when employers are paying 60 to 65% more people that have a college degree than those that don't. So my question to you is, you follow this stuff way more than I do. Where is the topic of education, at least within the Republican side of things right now?
It's really non-existent. You heard it a little bit in some of the debates. You hear about education. You usually hear about education in terms of, let's do away with the Department of Education. Ron Paul has been an advocate of doing away with the Department of Education. Rick Perry, rather, famously forgot about the Department of Education when he was talking about cutting departments. But you usually hear about education in terms of taking the federal government out of it from a Republican perspective. The federal government, or Republican Party, looks at the federal government and says, how can we make it as small as possible? And they want to put more power back in the hands of the states. And so from a Republican perspective, in this primary at least, you hear of education in terms of, we want the federal government to get out of it. So you don't hear a whole lot in terms of how the federal government can play a role in education other than getting out of it, leaving it to the states on a K-12 level. You hear a little bit about college affordability, but then they're looking at free market principles. You've heard it from Governor Romney, who talks about pumping up for-profit colleges because they offer a cheaper alternative to traditional public education. And Governor Romney believes that the for-profit industry can play a role in driving costs down. If more people start attending for-profit colleges and create that competition, those free market principles will take over and public universities will be forced to lower tuition in order to compete.
Yeah, the Romney thing, I got to say, that's one thing that's been interesting. I'm sending out a link to an article right now. It's something I talked about briefly on the show before, but talking about Romney's relationship with for-profits in general, specifically with Full Sail, which is down in Florida. You guys may be familiar. It's a for-profit, largely graphic media school, but we're talking about very strong relationships. And he did this whole thing where he talked about how for-profits are driving down the cost of education, but a Full Sail degree costs roughly, and I believe, from the best of my knowledge, about $80,000. So It's a very interesting conversation because it seemed to be a bit of a disconnect that I have not heard the argument for that for-profits. I've heard for-profits are making education accessible, and for-profits would argue, and I think to some extent truthfully, that they are educating the people that we don't want to educate, which I think is very unfortunate, but there are people that are not as ideal for students. I guess you could say don't have the grades, and these are the students that are falling onto for-profits. That's their argument in the past. But I do find it interesting that for-profits driving down the cost of education and Romney's relationship. Have you seen in the past, the for-profit issue is a big one. Have you seen any politicians having favorable relations with for-profits in the past? It seems to have getting on the bad side of regulation. It's kind of the first I've heard of it popping up where they're major donors and he's thanking them publicly and praising them.
You see it, it's starting to come around now as for-profits become big business. There was a story recently that said the CEO of the Art Institutes, and I think I'm pronouncing this right, Argosy online universities, the CEO of that company that runs those two made $13 million last year. In comparison, the highest ranking president in the Ivies, or the president of the Ivies who made the most, was a president who made $1.6 million last year. And I think most people out there would say, I'd rather send my child or I'd rather attend an Ivy League school than the Art Institute or Argosy. So you're looking at the CEO making $13 million versus Ivy League $1.6 million. And it's because what I started with earlier, education is becoming big business. People see a way to make money, they're going to do that, then they're going to use their money to try to create influence and try to create favorable environments for their business to continue to push it forward and make money.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's been really interesting to follow, but you're absolutely right. It definitely is. There's a lot of money at play. So with that said, when we're talking about Romney then with the for-profit issue, which has been, again, very interesting. Read the article, guys. And I'm not even necessarily knocking this, even though despite people knowing my political views generally and the fact that I do work at an online university that does offer some similar programs, this isn't about that. I think the article is just very interesting to understand the relationship because it's a lot deeper than one might think. But let's turn to, so what about Romney's competitors? Is there anything in particular in Newt's closet or anyone else that's still in the race that's worth understanding about the relationships with education in particular?
Well, I'm not sure it's worth paying much attention to anybody else in the race. I think Romney's pretty much sewn up the nomination or will soon. You hear some interesting things. I mean, Newt Gingrich is a former college professor, and yet he seems to not offer a whole lot on college education. His whole platform is about putting people back to work, getting people off the government dole. He likes to refer to the president as the food stamp president and talk about things like how he, if he could get invited to the NAACP, would go there and tell them that they should demand paychecks instead of food stamps. He's all about this notion of work, but you don't hear a plan from him about how he's going to make college more accessible, how he's going to make sure that people can get the education they need to get the sort of jobs that are required to get out of a welfare system and to have the sort of middle class lifestyle that you would need. So you don't hear a whole lot from Speaker Gingrich. In terms of somebody like Ron Paul just wants the federal government out of education. His whole thing is states and local governments. He's made it abundantly clear he wants to abolish the Department of Education. So when it comes to education, you're not hearing a whole lot. There aren't plans offered. But again, Governor Romney is the most likely Republican nominee, most likely to face President Obama in 2012. So it's almost not worth focusing on plans that they might have to offer.
So, I'm trying to think, before we get down into some rapid fire stuff, I do have one question in general. Let's talk about the local level just for a minute. And the reason is that, here on HigherEdLive, we always talk about higher education, but one thing that I've always felt for a long time is that we need to discuss a little bit more about K through 12. Because at the end of the day, every one of our students has come through K through 12 system. And how can we talk about changing higher education, making higher education better, when we can't talk about making the system better that brings students to us in the first place? So where are things at with K through 12, but specifically on the local level? We talked about federal regulations. We talked about state and state funding. Where are things locally? It seems to me, at least, there's been a larger separation than ever before in recent years. And this is me as a more of a casual observer, with the fact that when you leave it up to local governments to fund themselves, what you end up having is communities near each other that are just drastically different school systems, and that are producing drastically different results in different students. Where do you see things in both in the K through 12 world in general, and then within like the local political world, I guess you could say?
Well, a lot of that has to do with property taxes. On a local level, schools are funded, education is funded through property taxes. So you can have a very rich suburb right outside of a major city. I live here in Philadelphia, and you can have some major suburbs in the mainline area of Philadelphia that have multi-million dollar homes that have property values that are sky high. And what's done on a state level does not really affect a lot of those districts, because any state funding they get, and then subsequently any state funding they lose, they can make up for with a very small increase in property taxes. They have the base for it. They have the wealth in the communities for that. Other areas, very poor areas, they don't have property tax bases. And when they are able to generate property tax revenue, people aren't paying it. So you find a lot of situations where districts are struggling. It's supposed to be situations, most states have it set up where when you have these disparities in property taxes, the state's supposed to step in and make up that difference. Now, with a lot of budget deficits going on the state level, states are cutting that funding. So you're starting to see the disparity more now than ever. And you're going to see a lot of that going forward, because states don't have the revenue coming in to continue to fund education at the levels they do. And it's putting a greater strain on localities, on poor areas that don't have a property tax base to make up that difference.
Well, that sounds real optimistic. No, I'm kidding.
There are ways around it. I mean, here in Philadelphia, for instance, Mayor Nutter, who's the mayor of Philadelphia, is a big proponent of education. The Philadelphia schools are in serious financial trouble. And one of the ways he talked about it, because he didn't want to raise property taxes, again, you have a double-edged sword there. You raise property taxes, you can generate more monies for school. But at the same token, you raise property taxes too high, people are going to leave the city and go to other areas. So the mayor's tried to find innovative ways to do that. One proposal that he put forward was a tax on sugary drinks, for instance. And you see it in other places where they try to create these taxes on various luxury items, which will benefit the community in other ways. So a tax on sugary drinks, the revenue generated from that can go fund schools. It also has public health issues. It might get people to stop drinking so much soda, to stop eating so many sugary snacks, which will benefit their health. So there are ways that communities, cities are looking for creative ways to come up with funding that way. Another thing Philadelphia has proposed is leaving bars open for an extra hour. So in Philadelphia, bars close at 2 a.m. There's a proposal in the city council now that would leave bars open until 3 a.m. with the added revenue for the extra hour in alcohol sales tax going to help close the budget gaps in public schools. So legislators are trying to come up with creative ways. They're trying their best. Really, the best way to do it, and what we need is we just need a way to turn the economy around. We need to generate demand. We need to generate jobs so states, localities, and the federal government can have the revenue coming in, so we don't have to make cuts anymore.
Okay, I definitely hear you on that, and it's I think that there's some really interesting examples, and I do think the solutions that are going to get us where we need to be are going to have to be a little bit creative and different. So that said, Dan, we've covered the list of the main things I wanted to talk to you about today. Amazingly, I don't know if we packed all that in. So I want to enter what I'm calling the rapid fire round. So guys, if you are watching, I hope you're excited. Dan has opened himself up and said he wants to get some rapid fire questions from Twitter and see if he can keep up. So Dan, now I, mind you, already have a list of about 6 or 7. So I'm going to start reeling off these questions. Feel free to keep your answers brief. We're going to have more coming after you. And guys, if you're watching, bring on the questions. Mark Greenfield, you've asked a couple questions. I've noted them. They're going to be in here. But everybody else, please be ready for a little rapid fire Twitter politics of education. We're going to see how many we can get through. I only got so many, so I'm leaning on you guys to kind of make this stuff happen. So Ready, Dan?
I'm ready. Bring it on.
Rapid fire Twitter questions. Number one, Title IX. Any chance any politician is going to step up and ask for this thing to ever be repealed?
Never. Women voters vote at a higher rate than male voters, and that's just asking to not be reelected.
Okay, good to know. That's one thing that people always talk about is if that's going to change. By the way, you do have the option to pass if ever needed. It's like a game show. So,
right.
Who is the most dangerous?
Do I have a lifeline that I need?
If you want a lifeline, we can probably make that happen. I think so. Okay. Who is the most dangerous politician for the future of education today?
Well, I guess the short answer would be it depends which side of the aisle you fall on. My personal beliefs are really any politician who proposes abolishing the Department of Education.
Okay. State support for our campuses has been cut by hundreds of millions. How do politicians think that state institutions can keep costs down, or do they even think that they can keep costs down?
They don't think that, they don't really think about it. They figure that if anything, they'll make up the difference in tuition. There's also a sense that politicians have of if we have to tighten our belts, that local colleges and universities also have to figure out ways to tighten their belts.
Okay, there's been talk of state universities cutting lobbyists to save money due to these budget cuts. Is cutting lobbyists when the government's cutting your budget a good idea or a bad idea? Do they need to be more available in Washington, or do they need to be more agile?
It's a fantastic idea. If everybody will cut their lobbyists, this country would be better off and education would be better off. The college presidents can meet with individual members themselves. They don't need lobbyists for it.
When it comes to big education reform, who do you think is a big ally you want to give a shout out to as someone who's making strides, whether in federal, state government, outside, but somewhere in the political space that you think is trying to do this and doing it well?
I think Secretary Arne Duncan is important. If you ask most Republicans the best thing that President Obama has done during his term or who's his best cabinet pick, they'll point to Arne Duncan. I think the Race to the Top program has been an incredible success. Programs like it will benefit the federal government, so Arne Duncan really deserves a shout out as doing fantastic work.
Okay, I like it. So, will the feds bail out the student loan industry if this bubble bursts like people think that it will, same way as the housing industry?
In theory, the federal government already is bailing out the student loan industry because the federal government's already on the hook whether students default or not. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by bail it out since they're already on the hook for it. But like I mentioned before, they are doing things to try to take private lenders out and make college more affordable and loans easier for kids.
Okay, this is something you hammered on a little bit before, but I'm going to ask anyway. Can we save K through 12 without investing more money?
You can. It's going to take quality teachers. It's going to take parental involvement. It's going to take new technologies and innovation. It's going to take leadership that is open to change. And really, it's just going to take people to stop attacking teachers. They're hardworking people who dedicate their lives to educating our kids, and we shouldn't attack them. We should praise them for it.
Okay. Question coming in from Twitter. What about funding for research? Do politicians care about universities as research laboratories in addition to teaching? Good question.
Absolutely. During the appropriations season, appropriations is a fancy political word for earmarks. You hear earmarks thrown around a lot. There's a ton of earmark money that goes to funding research projects at local colleges and universities, in part because research dollars bring jobs, and politicians like credit for creating jobs in their districts.
Okay. The for-profit industry was obviously regulated pretty heavily in recent years with the federal government. They have seemed to pivot, at least with the conversations in Washington. Are the for-profits out of the woods as far as being in the scopes of Washington?
Absolutely not. About a year ago, the Obama administration cracked down a little bit on for-profits, saying that if for-profits didn't meet certain benchmarks and certain goals, their access to student loan funding was going to be cut off. They have 3 years to implement those programs. Now, I'm sure they're going to have a team of lobbyists and pour millions and millions of dollars in terms of weakening those rules. But it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 3 years, especially if President Obama is reelected, in terms of what they do with their graduation rates and what they do with their default rates. For-profit colleges have the highest default rates of anybody. in terms of student loans, and the federal government doesn't want to be on the hook for that money. So they're really going to crack down on for-profits if they continue to not graduate people and have those loans defaulted.
Talking about Obama then, Obama versus Romney, who's better for education, whether K through 12 or higher ed?
Again, it depends on your political persuasion. As somebody with my political persuasion, President Obama is by far better. He instituted Race to the Top, which was a way to force, or not necessarily force states, but allow states to pass a lot of reforms that the Obama administration viewed as friendly. There's a much stronger focus on education coming from President Obama than Governor Romney, and I think he'll do a better job of putting us back on that path to becoming first in the world in terms of college graduation rates.
Okay, talking about that then, Obama's 2020 goal, will we actually achieve it?
By 2020, no.
Okay, and next question, and final one probably for me. One of the big themes in today's conversation has been education is big business. Can education succeed as big business and thrive? Is it something where we have to lose that, or can we harness that and just pivot it in a new direction?
It's going to take an effort where the economy turns back around, so public entities, the government, takes a much more aggressive role in education. As the economy continues to weaken and soften, states, local governments, even the federal government is going to look for any ways to cut funding. They're going to look to cut funding to education, and the obvious alternative is if we cut money to education, somebody's got to be there to make up the difference, and that's going to be things like charter schools, charter school corporations, because I don't want to disparage charter schools. There are a lot of very good charter schools out there, but there are certain charter school corporations that really prey on public schools in their areas and do a disservice to the community and a disservice to students. And so it's going to take a situation where the government has the resources necessary to invest back in education before we sort of see that shift away.
Okay, interesting question coming in from Twitter from Tom, and I'm going to spin off this to a larger one, I think. His question was, do you see a move towards encouraging cutting general education requirements to speed completion of bachelor's degrees? And I think that might fall more in universities, but this brings up the broader question of accreditation. I mean, how far will the federal government let schools get as far as being creative in letting students graduate faster by changing requirements? I mean, obviously, there are a lot of accreditation issues. Is that something that you could see changing to do what Tom's suggesting here as a potential is if we make it sort of change requirements so students can graduate faster? Are politicians going to sit back and let that happen, or is that where they're going to want to get involved?
I think it depends on the changes that are proposed. We don't want to get in a situation where we're changing standards and we're weakening requirements just to get kids to graduate. At that point, you might as well just hand somebody a college degree with their high school diploma. It really serves no point. Now, if you're looking at ways where you cut certain requirements or you loosen certain requirements to allow kids to graduate sooner and they get the same education, I think that's something politicians will be very open to. I know myself, somebody who went to law school, there's absolutely no reason why law school should be 3 years. The only reason you're there for the third year is so law schools can get a third year of tuition out of it. So I think there is common ground there that politicians would be open to, as long as it's done in a manner where you're not actually weakening standards and you're not making it easier for kids to graduate without earning it.
Absolutely, and I think the point right there you hit on too is just assessment. Assessment is going to be the future of education for higher ed, is how do we assess? And I don't think we're doing a great job of doing that even now, saying how are we actually assessing if someone learned something. The future is going to show, I think, that if you can somehow, arguably, completely validate what someone has learned, it's going to matter less how they learned it, but it's going to have to make sure that it's a credible way that we all agree, yes, that person has learned it. That's a huge can of worms for a whole nother show, probably. But Dan, that is all the rapid-fire questions. I think you did a great job of surviving that. My hat's off to you.
Well, thank you.
Guys, I hope you guys enjoyed watching that portion of the show, too. I think we might have to make this a new regular feature. I don't know if our other guests can keep up, but after this, I had a lot of fun with it. So tweet me, guys. Let me know if you liked the rapid-fire round. And I guess, Dan, really, that brings us to the end of the conversation for today. I really appreciate your time in tackling the subject. What do you want to leave us with when it comes to politics and education?
I think really the last thing is just people need to realize education is the silver bullet issue in this country. We talk about the economy, we talk about healthcare, we talk about national security. All these issues you can all trace back to education. So if we can improve our schools, if we can make sure that kids can graduate, if we can find really dedicated, passionate people to be teachers, to give back to the community, then this country is really going to take off and thrive, and it's just going to be a cycle. We just got to push that ball slowly and get it just to turn downhill, and then it will take over and roll on its own. And education can really do that. So we need to put the money, put the investment back into education, and we'll see the results.
Could not agree more. Virtual round of applause, I should certainly hope, from our audience. Again, I can't agree more. That was a great way to end it. So, Dan, thank you so much for your time and for joining the program today.
Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you for watching Higher Ed Live. As always, we are live every Thursday afternoon at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Next week, we're back with a great show on life cycle marketing and management. That's right, life cycle marketing and management. It's a huge subject. What we're talking about is how do you take a student and not make them be a prospective, be a student, be an alum, but how do you find a system that treats them the whole way through the life cycle? This is a big conversation. We're going to turn some things on their heads. I hope you guys can tune in and make it. But until next time, you can always keep up on what we're doing at HigherEdLive.com. Take care.